Hi, Ashley Brotzel here. Let's talk about joining squares. A lot of my patterns are squares of various sizes. I have tutorial squares that are teeny tiny. I have small squares, which are not really that small, to be honest. And I have large squares, which do get quite large. Whoa, let's back up a bit. There he is. Large squares are quite large. Anyway, I also have blankets, but right now we're going to talk about squares. Mostly because of these cats. We're just finishing the year of cats, and it's 12 months, 1 square a month. All of my patterns are designed for interlocking crochet and overlay mosaic crochet. You get to choose which technique you prefer. The interlocking crochet version is 2 layers of mesh. So 2 layers of mesh, and it makes these little dots. That's the interlocking crochet version. And there's also a mosaic crochet version. Some of my older mosaic crochet patterns have the dots on the chart. So when you're doing it, you just double crocheting and single crocheting and you can still see the dots. And now I've been updating patterns to have them solid so that you can't see all these dots in a solid area. It doesn't need to be there for this technique. The cats, because it's a newer one, there is only the 2 options. There's interlocking crochet like this, or there's the solid overlay mosaic crochet. It's just the only option there is. The real issue, what we're talking about today, is once you make all these squares, what do you do with them? How do you make them into a blanket? Interlocking crochet, slightly more straightforward. You simply join the squares. Mosaic crochet, I know this is a gnome, I know. This is a gnome square from last year, but it's the same size as these ones, and I don't have the other cats here. So mosaic crochet, you get all these little fringe things on the edges. Makes it difficult if you're going to join them. You do have the option of weaving all these in. That's one option. You could join your squares and you could just hide these at the back so that the front would still look nice. It's not my favorite option either, although I have seen some people do it and they talk about like rag quilts, how you get those. Have you ever done a rag quilt? Like it's part of the process. It's part of the thing. So that's an option. My preferred method is an envelope border. Now, this one has the envelope border on all 4 sides. That just makes the whole square bigger. You don't actually need the envelope border on the top and the bottom though, because there's no fringe, right? So you could just put a border on the sides, the part that has fringe, which will then make all of your squares rectangles. Not the end of the world. They're still going to be joinable. So, preference, always crochet, there are no rules. You get to do what you want. It's your project. What do you want it to look like? How do you want it to feel? That sort of thing. I'm just going to give you options. You get to decide. When you finish your interlocking square, you have the option of putting a border around the edges. And my adjusted border, or whatever I'm calling it, it's in the pattern. It locks the 2 layers together. So I'm taking 1 string from this contrasting color as well as this, and it's locking it all together. If you don't lock it together, you do get a little bit of a flap. Not a big deal in my opinion, but some people don't like it, so that's why options are available. Whether you have done a border, like this one has the border but it hasn't picked up the flaps, so you can see these are all single crochets, or you can have the locked in border, so it's still all single crochets but now there's no flap. The other option is that you don't have any border at all. You haven't done single crochet border at all, but you can still join these squares. The black is my main color, so I would still join the black to the black. So if you keep watching, I'll go over that a little bit more. So interlocking crochet is straightforward. Mosaic crochet, I suggest doing the envelope border first. When you're making the squares, you can do the envelope border and close it up. Or if you know you have lots of squares to join and they're all going in the same project, you can leave the flaps open. And then when you join them, you can join the back flaps and the front flaps. It gives it a slightly different texture, that's all. So this one, when you join it, it will have it'll be like a fluffy envelope border that's joined, as opposed to joining the 2 ends. Now, depending on how fluffy your yarn is, the differences are not going to be that extreme, but those are the things that you're going to want to think about when you're deciding how to deal with these squares. I always suggest these little tails to weave those in first before you try to join things. First thing to know is that it is easiest to join squares that are the same size, because then you know that the edges are going to have the same number of stitches. That's the easiest method. It is possible to join squares that have different sizes. First thing I would do is prepare all of my squares. I would put, if I knew that I was going to be joining these together, I would put one envelope border along these edges. So you could join these squares first at the part that doesn't have fringe, and then when you're doing your envelope border, you just keep going all the way across. You don't have to cut the yarn, which means there's one seam here that you won't have to worry about, right? So first join your squares together where they can be, then do the envelope border. That would be how I would do it for the cat squares, for example. When you join squares, do you prefer to use a needle or a crochet hook? There are pros and cons, both techniques, of course. Regardless of which technique you're using, you're going to want to put your squares either both wrong sides together or both right sides together, depending on what you're doing. Make sure that the top is the top on both squares. When you're using a needle, you need to pre-measure your yarn. You don't want it to be too long because you have to pull it through for every stitch, but you don't want to run out either. And I don't like having to guess at how much yarn I'm going to need, and the yarn gets tangled when you're pulling it through every stitch, so I'm not even really going to show this option. I don't think that using a needle and thread is great for joining squares. First, make sure you got some yarn, make sure things are lined up, corner to corner, top corner to top corner, of course. I like to start with a slip knot, but that is optional. Some people really don't like the knots. Make sure that you go into the corner stitch, either your outer layer, which for me is black here. You can go into the outer layer only, or you can pick up a loop of the purple, which is like my accent color, that inner layer. Because I have not added the border, that single crochet border, I haven't added a basic border, I haven't added the adjusted border. I like to lock in just the corners when I'm joining the squares. It's my preferred way. Once the corners are locked, I don't go into the accent color anymore, just through the main color window, which for me is black. This is a single crochet join, so I'm inserting my hook around both black on both squares, then bringing up the loop around them both, and then yarn over and pulling it through both loops on my hook, creating the single crochet. So go under both, pull it up, single crochet. Put 2 stitches in each window. Make sure you're going through the window on both squares, the same windows, lining them up. 2 stitches in each window, which is basically what the border was supposed to be. And if you don't do the border, you just do it now when you're joining the squares. If you did do the border, then you'll put your joining stitches just into those border stitches, 1 stitch per 1 stitch. You'd have already done 2 stitches in the windows. I hope that makes sense for you. So here I'm just putting 2 stitches into the window gaps all the way down. This is what it looks like when it's done. It is slightly raised. You can feel the bump. It's a bit texturized. And if you haven't done the border that locks both layers in, you could pull it apart and see through there. Not really a big deal for me. Another option is our slip stitch join, sometimes called a flat braid join. It will lie smoother than the single crochet join, and it uses a little bit less yarn, but it can feel awkward to pick up your yarn. You want to make sure your yarn stays in the middle, and you create a slip stitch on one square, then the other square, back and forth, but don't forget that you need to make sure there are 2 stitches in each window still. And it looks really nice when it's done, but the hurdle is just this awkwardness of getting your yarn. That's probably the hardest part about it, and keeping track of your count, because if you don't have stitches, if you haven't done the border like me, you have to make sure that it's 2 and 2, otherwise it won't keep things lined up and your squares will start to get crooked. So awkward to do, harder to count for me, maybe not so much for you, but looks nice and uses less yarn. So definitely a great option. Just wanted to point out, if you have 2 pieces that already have the border on them, the single crochet border where you've put 2 stitches in every window, then when you're joining it, you don't need to worry about counting windows. You just do 1 stitch to 1 stitch. And if you're doing it this way, I still think that the slip stitch, the flat braid, is the best one. And this is how you would do it if you don't want to put the slip knot. You're going to have to weave the tail in afterwards, make sure it's secure. Pick the back loop and do your slip stitch. And then if it's laying down on the table, it's easiest for me. The loop that's on the table, the back loop, if this is the front, pick the back loop. That's how you know which loop to use. and then you pull it through a slip stitch, and you just do one stitch over here, one stitch over here. You can use the full stitch if you prefer, if you don't want to use just the back loop. But when you're doing back loop, sometimes people get confused if you're holding it like this and you're like, well, which one's back? Because I mean, it's the back loop over here, but technically over here it's the one closest to you, right? It's the loops that are touching. And that is how I would do it. Back and forth, slip stitch over here, going into the middle of it, slip stitch over here. If you want to join two mosaic pieces that already have the envelope borders on them, it's similar to what we just did with the interlocking crochet squares, where you're just picking up one stitch over here and one stitch over here, join them together. This is a very thick stitch. And I think that the slip stitch join, the flat braid join, is the nicest. It's my preferred. So if you can find a back loop, or if you're not sure what to stitch to pick, as long as it's consistent. So as long as you can find something that is consistent all the way across, you're like, well, that bump, that, then you can join them. You can also pick two loops if you're having a hard time deciding which one is the right one. Now you can see I put it in up. That is also not what I would do. I would go down. Sometimes when I'm looking at the piece, I forget what I'm doing. You know what I mean? Slip stitch this way down into the piece and pull up your slip stitch down into the piece. And if your colors were better, you wouldn't see the join, but mine is just hodgepodge squares, so definitely the join is going to be visible. And it feels awkward. It's one of those things that takes practice. If you've been crocheting for a long time, you might say, oh, this is awkward, I don't like it, I won't do it. And you forget how awkward it used to be when you started crocheting. It's okay to do things that are new and uncomfortable. Give it a try. It is also okay to simply say, no, I don't like that, I won't do it. It's your project. It's not going to hurt my feelings if you say I don't like that join. I just wanted to show off some options. So if you have two pieces that you need to join, this is an option. If you use a different color, you might not even see it. The other option, we got more. You have squares that don't have envelope borders that are sealed, like we just did. You can do open envelope borders where you're joining the top layers and the bottom layers that are open. It allows you to still hide everything in between. And I would still use the same flat braid join where you're going from the top down into your project, picking up one slip stitch, then you go into the back loop over here, pick up one slip stitch. It still creates a nice join, and your colors will either make it pop or hide it. If it's the same color as everything, you won't even really see it. So those are good options. If you've done an envelope border like this that goes around only two sides, you don't even have to cut your yarn. You can just keep going around. If you've done an envelope border that goes around four sides, I would suggest making strips. So you'd have two squares here and two squares here, and you could just keep going. And then afterwards, you'd want to go across the top. And of course, you want to join the front and the back. That's how I do it. That's an extra step, but worth it.